Welcome to the Control the Room podcast, a series devoted to the exploration of meeting culture and uncovering cures for the common meeting. Some meetings have tight control, and others are loose. To control the room means achieving outcomes while striking a balance between imposing and removing structure, asserting and distributing power, leaning in and leaning out, all in the service of having a truly magical meeting. This episode is brought to you by Mural, a digital workspace for visual collaboration. At Voltage Control, we use Mural to facilitate engaging and productive meetings and workshops from anywhere. Mural gives teams the means, methods, and freedom to collaborate visually. Use their suite of facilitation superpowers to control the virtual room and solve tough problems as a team with their pre-built templates and guided methods. To see for yourself why companies like IBM, Atlassian, and E-Trade rely on Mural, start your 30-day trial at mural.co. That's mural.co. Today, I'm with Tyrome Smith, Principal Consultant at GoIn LLC. The world is moving fast. GoIn can help you move faster. So excited to have you on the show today, Tyrome.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here.
Excellent. So I guess for starters, would love to hear how you got started in this work that you do.
So I'm from Pennsylvania. My father used to be a police officer. He retired from the Pennsylvania State Police. And so when I was in 1985, graduated from high school, I knew I was going to college. That summer I graduated, I worked at McDonald's. Stank. The following summer, the police chief came to me and said, "Hey, I got a position." Very small town, by the way. I got a position. You interested? Now, I'm a track and field guy for a very long time. I was a state champion runner in high school, hurdler, as a matter of fact. And I was like, sure, because it kept me close to my dad. All right, it gave me a way to connect with him. I did that for about 4 years on and off through college. I'd got some leadership roles in undergraduate school, and that introduced me to a different way of thinking about the world. I decided I didn't want to do police work anymore, and I started working with kids. And I was utterly fascinated with what was happening with these children's lives. Went to graduate school at Howard University in 1993, and I came in about halfway through the first that year. So I came in the winter. They had no more money, so I needed to find a job. And I went to work because I had worked previously with kids, went to work in a psychiatric hospital. And I saw things in community meetings that I did not quite understand. And so I think it was that following fall, I took a class with a professor, Dr. Leroy Wells, brilliant man, PhD in organizational dynamics out of Yale. And he did some stuff on the board. It was a group dynamics course, and he did some stuff on the board that just blew my mind, because it was the same kind of dynamics that he was describing I was seeing every day when I was working with these kids. And what I came to find out is that those basic systems that we are all born into, either healthy or unhealthy, known as our family, replicate themselves in organizations. And out of that, I started working with kids a little bit more, but I moved away from working with kids in about 2000, started working with organizations. And it was still the same dynamic that I was seeing working with those children in different formats, with their families in different formats. I was starting to see in organizations. Now, there's a caveat to that. And that is, I hate when people say, we're like a family here, because my family might be screwed up and yours might be great. So we're dealing with two different kinds of family systems. But I understand why people want to do that, because they are using their group of note, the one that they grew up with. Out of that, I started dealing and working with more sophisticated organizations. I had an opportunity to work in New York City with At Home Box Office as a vice president for organizational effectiveness there for about a year and a half. And since then, about 2009, I've been working in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, working with senior leaders, helping them think about strategy, think about innovation, thinking about growth, thinking about what's happening in the world, and how do they manage their organizational designs to execute against value. And that's what I've been doing since 2009 with the same organization. It's great. I'm having a ball. Even in the pandemic, actually, our work is even more important now because of the pandemic than it was probably before the pandemic, because the world is changing. The director of our agency says that if we come back in, oh, God bless, and the creek don't rise, in March of 2021, and we are doing the same things that we were doing in March of 2020, we will have lost. And so that's where I come from.
Incredible. It's great to hear all of that. And, as I listened and thought about just the impacts of COVID on organizational development and even just behavioral elements of teams trying to relate to one another and in meetings in general, much less now that we're kind of thrust in these new environments. So I'm curious what you're seeing. What's some low-hanging fruit that people could start to think about? I'm sure there's some little things that they can do if they can't afford the big power, the big smart folks like yourself.
Yeah, be present, which is probably the most difficult thing, to be present for one another. I'm working with a group right now of really smart people, and one of the gentlemen that your audience may know, his name is Tristan Comer. He wrote me and he said, what happens if I get somebody's name wrong? If I mispronounce somebody's name? Because this group that we've been working on has been looking at the Black Lives Movement, race and racism, and we've been thinking about that. And he said, what do I do if I get that? Is that being racist? I was like, no, that's not. What is being racist is when you're not present to the other person's experience, when you don't acknowledge their humanity. And if you look at the word human, the root word to human is hume, H-U-M. And hume in Latin means is ground. It is ground. And so what greater gift could you give somebody else than to ground yourself in their experience? And so I think for not just leadership, but for each other, to ground ourselves, empathy, whatever you want to call it, to ground ourselves in their experience so we could be a gift to them is probably the best thing that we could do, in my estimation, that we could do for one another, particularly during the pandemic, because we have been dislocated. We're like, we're engines with very powerful boats with no rudder. It was a buddy of mine who was an Air Force, he would kill me if he heard me say that. Who was a Navy pilot. He said, we're all thrust and no vector right now. We're just moving, but we have no way to vector our energy. And so we feel lost. We feel dislocated. We feel somewhat dispossessed. We don't know where our jobs are anymore, where our values are anymore. The fact that people aren't going someplace to go to work. I'm dealing with an organization right now, a member of the organization I consult to, and the leader's like, yeah, I have people who've been working in this same job for 30 years that are now displaced, and they can't go back into work. They are saying to themselves and to her, but I only know how to do work when I'm inside the building. I only know how to do my job when I'm inside the building. But she's saying, but the customers that we have don't need our stuff from inside. They need to be able to create value. And you guys are valuable even when you're not in the building. What can you do? I can't do that. I mean, literally scared. And so I'm working with her to kind of rethink, what does that mean to hold people in a space where they don't have to feel fear, that they can still provide value, still move forward, and do good work. It's important for each one of us to be present. I don't have to make you feel good. Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety. She's a brilliant woman. I've had an opportunity to sit down and talk to her and hear her lectures, and we brought her into my agency to do some work. To lecture. The idea that you can provide a safe space will create trust, but you can't ask somebody to trust you unless they feel safe. What is it? All dogs are animals, not all animals are dogs. And so what can I do to help others feel safe? And I think that that's the biggest thing that we can do for one another, is just be present right now. And that doesn't take anything else but a little bit of common sense.
I want to talk a little bit more about the humanity element of human and Hume. And, I think before the show started, we talked a little bit about our duty as citizens and how this work that we do could be applied in a much broader scope and a more macro scope. So I'm curious to hear how you're thinking about just citizenship and then, kind of being there for the broader community.
Thank you. I belong to an organization known as the A.K. Rice Institute. I'm on the board of that organization. And the A.K. Rice Institute studies social systems. And one of the ways we study social systems is we go the layer below how we would normally think about social systems. In other words, like who talks to who, when do we meet? But the layer below that is, how do we understand each other? How do we, become a part of each other's lives? Kind of an unconscious level. And one of my fellow directors is a psychiatrist. He's written a book called Finding a Place to Stand. And in that book, he talks about citizenship. And he says people join organizations, but they are citizens to institutions. And I'm completely fascinated by that idea, because he writes that when you are a citizen, you show it very differently because it is something greater than yourself. When you're a member of an organization, you are bound by the tasks, you're bound by the resources, you're bound by your role of getting things done. But you join an institution, think United States. You join an institution as a citizen because you say that when we combine our organizational lives, the institution is greater. What the impact of the institution is greater, that's when you become a citizen. And I think that organizations have the capacity to create citizens. It's when institution, not organization, I want to mix up my metaphors, that institutions can create citizens. But they can't do it without some kind of notion of where we're going, North Star, strategy, whatever you want to call it, that says when we combine our efforts, we will get to that place. And that's when you can see people say, oh, I now know how I work with you to create something greater than I individually can do. That's when citizens show up. Now, are all citizens the same? Well, the history of the United States would suggest no. But how do we create and claim citizenship? Sometimes it's leaders being present. I hear you. I am here for you. I understand. I am selflessly putting myself in place so that I can marshal resources, so I can marshal ideas. Sometimes it's citizens standing up for their place. I will be seen. I have an idea. If this is an organization, how do we create space for our corporate citizens to do the right thing? The organization that I'm with now, the small team, and I say small, we're the agency is well over 10,000 people, but my team is 5 people big, 6, soon to be 5 people big, and we are saying to folks as they go out, how do you create space to create innovation? Because right now they all get targeted for their, we would know this, the KPIs are how many things did you produce, not how much value did you create. And good leaders can create space for people to create value because good citizens find value. They understand what is valuable, what will create value for the greater good versus just for me. People belong to organizations, make sure that the trains run on time, but have no concept of why the trains are running.
It makes me think that it really is about purpose and what brings us all together.
Yeah, I think purpose is completely underrated. Why are we here? Simon Sinek talks about start with why. During our training, we ask people to identify problems. We say, identify your problems and interrogate that problem by asking why as many times as you can. And people have difficulty because they want to go to the how and the what, but they have difficulty identifying the why. And I think institutions help people to identify the why, but institutions can lose their way and become organizations. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So organizations that want to behave more like institutions or maybe want to attract that those elements, what are some of the things that they can think about?
Yeah, I think those are the organizations that have the capacity to interrogate their own value. But that takes very, very sophisticated leadership, selfless leadership, ones who are saying, but are we in a position that we want to be? Ones that Steve Blank says, he wrote a very seminal article. Maybe some of your audience may have read it, HBR article. So I think it's entitled, the proper title is Why the Lean Startup Changes Everything. And then he says, he quotes that pugilist philosopher, Mike Tyson, that says, everybody had a plan until they get punched in the mouth, right? And for me, it's the institutions that can bounce back from the punch in the mouth. He's like, oh, don't do that again. Now pivot. The arrogant institutions, the ones that don't learn, and maybe that's where I'm going. The ones that can attract are the ones that are learnful, that have an intention to learn. The ones that get punched in the mouth and say, oh, don't do that again. The ones that will continue to be organizations will be the ones that will say, yeah, but we're still going to go this way. because that's where we said we're going to, and I'm right. And I know that that's right. I was just listening to another podcast the other day, and this is, so I think it was Deloitte wrote The Big Shift in about 2010, and it keeps coming up, that those organizations that used to be the blue chip top 50 plus, that were the Mobiles of the world, the GEs of the world, they have been delisted off the blue chip. And now the blue chip ones are the ones that are constantly in an effort to understand their environment.
Tyrome, I'm really curious, given all this work that you're doing with organizations and understanding how to help them innovate, help them move past big, roadblocks or incumbents that might be kind of hard to move past, or, upstarts that are challenging the status quo. And you were very familiar with an institution that is challenged at the moment. You mentioned Black Lives Matter earlier, and the police are getting, calls for being defunded, et cetera. I'm curious, as someone who's gone through that institution, knows what it's like, what the needs are, the good that it can do. I'm curious, where your thoughts are as you apply the work you do through the lens of the change that needs to happen there.
As a son of a police officer, as a former police officer for a while, as the brother of somebody who's been in law enforcement in the United States military, I recognize that it is an institution that is much older than anything that I think folks could really understand. The history of policing goes back to the slave catchers. They would go and they were legally able to go back and recapture slaves, all the way up to, to now. Right? The ethic of what policing was due. It was a service to go back and execute against laws that were out there. Now, having been on that side, I recognize that there are laws and that you need people to help execute those laws, that you need people to help enforce those laws, because it is for the part of society. The book that I offered up before, Finding a Place to Stand, my psychiatrist colleague, he's 78 years old. And he said one time, as a result of what was going on with the Black Lives Matter and with policing, he said, one of the things that he said that just struck me dead square in the chest. He said, as a 78-year-old white man, I am ashamed that I didn't realize that police and policing was there to protect my community from those others. And that's a powerful statement as far as I'm concerned. It's a powerful indictment about how we've constructed this thing known as policing. So a long time ago, I thought, could I use what I've learned about organizations, about the lives of organizations, to help police officers rethink how they do community policing? I never explored it because it wasn't quite the right time. But now, as I'm talking to you, it brings me to the point where I'm like, maybe I really need to go back and rethink what that would look like, to go back and help police officers rethink about what it means to be a community police officer. How do I integrate and utilize my authority in a way that it is to add to the lives of the community and not detract, big air quotes, detract from the lives of the community? So people see me as somebody who is a helpmate and not somebody who is a oppressor. The stories about policing, at least in the Black community, are old. You can go back and listen to some of the songs from the Harlem Renaissance. You can go back and listen to the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance, and they were talking about brutality way back there. And so it is a hard problem. It is an institutional problem. It is not an organizational problem. It's not about the police. It's about the institution of policing inside the larger institution of America. And I think the work that I do to help people solve these hard problems, to ask the problem to be solved, is possible. You can actually do some brilliant work. I've seen people do brilliant work and come to some realizations and change their minds by asking these very simple, and I mean truly simple. I've thought about starting a podcast, and my podcast the title of the podcast was, can I ask you a question? Because I believe simple questions lead to complex insights.
Yeah, let's unpack that a little bit, because I do feel like questions are the facilitator's superpower. So what are some of your favorite questions, or the the questions that you find typically will lead to some of these complex insights?
So when we work, my colleagues and I, when we work with organizations, we're trying to help them create a product, rethink a process, maybe do even to the point of doing a reorganization. This is my everyday life. We ask four, and we just developed a fifth question. And the questions go, what problem are you solving? Right? Just plainly, what problem are you trying to solve? For whom are you trying to solve that problem? To do what to solve that problem? How will you know that you're on the way to solving the problem? And what's the one thing that the problem would really, really get to? And the reason why we got to this fifth one, the first one we've been asking for a long time, but apparently, a colleague of mine found this really interesting video about rowing a boat. It was the British, I think it was the 88 games. The 88 games, they were, the guy won, the British won a gold medal. They had not won anything. And they kept their eye on the one thing that matters. And it was, will it make the boat go faster? Right? Will it make the boat? How do we cut our hair? How do we train? How do we pray? How do we, get in the boat? What kind of shoes do we wear? What's our dinner like? How do we manage our home life? Will it make the boat go faster? And so those are our five. What problem are you trying to solve? For whom? To do what? How will you know? And what's that one thing that'll make it better? What's that North Star that you're looking at?
I love this notion of the one thing. I think it gets to the core of the essence of the problem. And so many meetings, so many gatherings, so many times when we come together to make a decision or to do some good work, if we're not clear on that, that's what can lead to all the circular conversation or these side chats and, this stuff that just slows us down. And I was thinking about the story you told about rowing the boat faster, and it immediately conjured up this image of like arguing over if they should enter the boat in some certain way, or like what color they should paint the boat and all this stuff. It really helps you realize that, wait a second, our purpose is to make the boat go faster. The color's not going to matter. I don't really have much of a fight. Like there's no reason to spend too much time on this decision.
Let's unpack that boat going faster thing, right? So the color of the boat may not matter, but it's the joining of the team that gets to the color of the boat that does matter to make the boat go faster. You feel me?
Yes, it is, absolutely.
It's about, can we join in a way that we are able to work? My colleagues that I work with, we believe that no matter how you show up to work with whoever you show up, if you show up to do the work, you can be there. Two of my colleagues, straight white men with children, we're going out to do some diversity work. They asked me, how are we going to do diversity work? That's because we're two straight white men. I was like, with kids, yeah, just show up. Coming together. So they asked me and I'm older than both of them, as an older black man, straight black man with two kids, help us get together because we don't know if we will be able to do the work. Can you help us? Not giving them permission, but can you help us think through it? Because I didn't give them permission. The only thing I gave them permission to do was to be themselves, which they didn't need permission for me to do that. They just needed to show up and do the work. But our ability to collaborate across the boundary of our differences makes our team that much stronger. That happened well over a year ago. And that team, except for one who got a really good job and went off and left us, that team is still together. And because we have the capacity to be honest with each other, what we call radical candor, and ask good questions and investigate each other's purposes, man, you talk about a highly functioning team. But when you have a team that can't even come together and say, you know what, to your point, that's whatever. That doesn't even matter what you're talking about, but can't have the conversation about that doesn't even matter and not get pissed off at one another and say that this is a part of our getting together and doing good work. So when we have to find that and work on that thing that's super important, we know what we need to do. So the team comes together and says the boat should be painted this way. I don't agree. Well, let's talk about it. Let's figure it out. That's wonderful. Okay, we figured it out. Now that team that gets in that boat, that when the coxswain says, pull harder, do this, everybody knows exactly what that means. There is no, and I don't even know I know the coxswain just yells at the rowers and yells something and they just pull harder. But the coxswain is now in that boat and that team knows because it's for the good of the boat, it's for the good of the team, we will make this happen. And there is no argument. The same thing happens. One of my colleagues is former special operations, and my brother is as well. When you are 6 deep and you are miles from anybody else that can provide support, and the only person you have to depend on is the other 5 dudes on your team, you dadgum sure better make sure that you can come to some coherence about what we're here to do. Because if you don't, that's life and death. That's not just what are we going to eat tomorrow for lunch.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of interesting ritual and training for special operations around trust in your fellow officers. And because when it comes down to in the moment, it's life or death. I mean, that's ultimate trust, right? Like we can't have any micro kind of guesses or take a moment to be like, well, maybe. It's like, nope, you got to be 100%.
I'm curious about this idea of ritual and which rituals do we keep and which rituals do we let go of?
That's right. Which ones serve us and which ones get in our way? And here's the thing. I think you were talking about our organizations that reinvent themselves versus the ones that are just, maybe overly dogmatic and can't let go because maybe something served them for years and years and years. And I think that's the ritual that stifles us. But when we can create ritual that is adaptable, we can move beyond it. Also, I would argue meta rituals too, like rituals that are designed to be flexible by nature, right?
Yeah. And as you're saying that, the power of ritual is to help us manage transition and uncertainty, right? That's why we have ritual. That's why people salute. In your military, they salute people because it helps us to manage the transition from an uncertain place to an uncertain place. Well, an uncertainty is a certainty. And so I don't know what's going on, but at least I have this to stand on.
It's our bedrock.
This
right?
makes sense. Exactly. But I love your idea that if your rituals aren't adaptive to the context in which they live, you are at risk.
And the context is ever evolving, right? So we don't know what it'll be like on tomorrow or the day after.
Absolutely. I think that folks who say, I don't recognize this doesn't make any sense to me. There's a sense of the dinosaur. I don't want to be that cavalier, but it's, are you paying attention to what's happening around you? And if you're not paying attention to what's happening around you, are you going to be around to influence it and to survive in it? And it doesn't mean that you don't continue some of the things that give you salve and comfort, right? But you need to be able to say, this is no longer in the service of the work of us accomplishing the task. There are stories about when people walk into manufacturing facilities and they, the whole Lean Six Sigma, when they try to do Agile and they say, well, why are you doing it? Well, that's just how we do it. Well, what happened if you cut that out? Well, I don't know. I would submit to you that it has 2 pieces. One, there's a technical piece to it. I don't know because they really don't know because they never took it out. But the other part is an unconscious and kind of meta, which is, but if you cut that out, I don't have any more value. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing now. And I think that freaks people out even more. I think, as a matter of fact, I think that that's the bane of what we see as society today, is that if I am no longer in that space, am I important? And that is scary.
Yeah, it's that fear of irrelevance.
Oh my God. Yeah. And if I am irrelevant, am I important? Do I really exist? I mean, this is existential stuff. I mean, I get it. But having people rethink their value, I think, is the purview of good facilitation. It's the purview of good consultation. It's the purview of good coaching, right? Helping people recenter and find themselves in terms of value, how they create value. It's an incredible piece of work if you can do that for folks.
Yeah. And, I think it's maybe not only helping people become reflective of their own value, but also providing space where people can provide value outside of the thinly drawn lines that you've carved out for them to create value. So if we open it up and we say we truly become inclusive, people talk about diversity and inclusion, but if we were to be truly inclusive, then we're allowing people to color outside the lines and to provide value in ways that we never anticipated. And then therefore they see the road to providing more value, even if their current value is disrupted.
It's interesting that, Doug, that you say this, because in the training we talk about Frank Gehry. Don't fall over your first idea. And we use the example of the Weatherhead School at Case Western University. And this looks like just a plop of steel and glass and brick, and how he came to that. And so not so much about Gehry, but about architecture, right? How do we create architectures, human architectures, that people can find space to exist? I'm not an architecture student, but I'm fascinated by this idea of creating, architecting, designing space so people can find space. And I think that our institutional architectures are so rigid because of ritual, are so rigid that when people ask for space, the institutions rebel against space. Now, if you follow the line of this conversation, let's follow it back about 10 minutes. And that's what policing does. Policing manages space. Because if you don't stay within your space, I have, Ty Smith, my dad, Eugene Smith, have arrested people and taken them to jail because they violated the space, the architecture, the social architectures of the institution. And I think what good leadership does, what good facilitation can do, is help people to explore and interrogate that space so people can find space, find their own space, and say, I belong here too. Now, the question then becomes, do those who have constructed the space want other people to be included in the space? I don't know.
Yeah. That's the thing, I think, is to make that shift between just having minions versus having citizens, like you were talking about, making sure that when we look at the space we've created, that we give people the opportunity to self-identify as to how they exist and how they bring their best selves to the space. It's interesting when I think of facilitation as a meta role where leaders start to adopt facilitated leadership styles. That's exactly what we're talking about. I love this notion of making constituents feel more like citizens. I love this idea of like shaping space. We may take the raw space that we've already have allocated and we might carve it up in interesting ways. We may ask our citizens to help us make sense of the space so that we can carve it up in a way we can co-create the decorations for that space so it's more inviting. It's easier for them to understand. I love how this conversation was like not very facilitator focused, but there's so many themes that apply to facilitation that is very clear to me.
So it's interesting that you say that, Doug, because the metaphor then applies. I think that what you're offering up, the metaphor of the facilitator as architect, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. In fact, facilitators are the architects of meetings. They're also the producer and the constructor, or they're in the meeting live, but they have to plan. I would say 90% of the facilitator's job is the upfront work before the meeting happens. And, we have this belief at Voltage Control that, whether you call yourself a facilitator or not, or you have facilitator in your title, if you invite people to a meeting and you're hosting that meeting, you are facilitating that meeting, whether or not you're intentional about it or whether or not you're applying any craft to it, you're still facilitating. And so our goal is that everyone starts to understand that more deeply, and meetings in general become more pleasant to attend and more productive.
Well, let me turn it back on you just a bit. So if that is the case, that you're architecting these experiences, what is the role of the facilitator in these architected experiences to help people find their authentic and authorized voice?
Yeah, well, it starts with purpose and intention. You talked about the necessity of purpose. So step one is realizing it's necessary. Because if we don't realize it's necessary, we certainly don't plan in ways to do it. And then I think that then we plan in ways to do it. And I'd be curious about how you approach it. But the first thing that comes to mind for me is co-creation is such a powerful tool. Like if people come together to if they're truly bringing their thoughts to the table, then that's how they can tap into what's authentic for them.
The requirements that I have whenever I help facilitate, and it's funny because there is a curious blend of experience and professional space that is training, facilitation, consultation, and coaching. And I'm differentiating all four of those that happened for me at one time. It is not very clean. It is like Bruce Lee and Jeet Kune Do, where you take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and a little bit of that, and you flow like water, and you find people where they are. I think for me, in fact, I know based on the training I have about group relations, you manage the boundary, time, task, and territory. Like, what are we here to do? And the answer is in the room. And you're helping people discover that. The answer is always in the room. That they've come to this space, this sacred time, space, location to do some work, and the work is in here. My task is to help them discover, to co-create. In a process of discovery, they go, holy, that was real. What the hell just happened? Something happened in that room that I want to get back to. I know I'm always successful in a true facilitation when people they'll come to me a year later and it's like, you know that thing that we talked about? I went home and I talked about it with my husband, and it changed my life with my spouse. It changed my life with my wife. It helped me have a different kind of conversation. I don't know. It could have been about how to build a bridge, but the way that we got to that space of how to build a bridge and asking real questions, that the architecting of the experience helped people really think about themselves and their relationships differently.
I think that's beautiful. Whenever we can truly tap into something authentic and something personal, when they bring it into their personal lives. Because the reason they do that is because it feels natural, right? Because it already tapped into that space. So honestly, I think that's where the real work happens. When we can get people into that feeling of being human, they're going to do amazing work. And, I think there's a really awesome, there's so many tactics and ways to do this, but I don't know if you have some favorite tools, but one of the tools that I'm a big fan of is authentic relating. I think if we really want people to tap into who they are and to connect with people on that level, using some of those games and tools can be a nice way to prime them before we get into some more specific work around, here's this problem we're trying to solve. Let's get them in the mindset first and then flow into the work.
It's interesting. When I did a lot more, we're talking, my oldest boy is 17 now. And so 15 years ago, I used to do a lot more stuff when I would have, games and this, and it's powerful and it works. I am always curious about how the people that I work with, because I get a chance to work with senior leaders in organizations about this stuff, would they be willing to play games? And games are truly important. I mean, don't get me wrong. For me, in the moment, I do the work with them about the thing that they came to do. This may sound harsh, but I punch them right in the face with it in a loving, caring way that is like, what are you really trying to do? Because what I heard was this. And part of it is my training in this idea of group relations and how we do our work, how I've been trained to do the work over the last 25 years and blah, blah, blah. But really getting people to be hyper focused and go to where their affect and their intellect meet. Now, that might be in terms of getting them to write, getting them up on the board, getting them to talk, getting them to move. I will say this. It is not that I don't trust games, because I do trust games. For me, it's more important to get up and touch the walls. Touch the walls. Get up out of your seat, move your body, find yourself in space. Where are you in space? Because where you stand and who you stand next to and how close you stand to the task that we're supposed to, and literally how close do you stand to the work that if it's on the wall, how close do you stand to that, is telling about your relationship to what you're trying to do. So the games for me and the activities like that is about helping people create relationship to one another and relationship to the work. How close do you really, really want to get to doing this hard stuff? It's funny, 10 years ago, I did an offsite, bunch of senior leaders, and I said to them, I don't even remember what they were working on, but I do remember that I said to them, be prepared to do the hard work of the soft stuff. Because it's that soft relational work that people dread.
Yeah, I mean, earlier you talked about how people struggle with purpose so much, and I think it's because it's softer, it's squishier, it's like comes from the heart, not from the muscles,
Amen. Amen. And now this is a horrible metric, but when we're doing like diversity work, and if nobody cries, that means they ain't doing the work. That's a horrible metric. I've been thinking about that, rolling around the back of my head, but I offer it up because if you are intending to do work around race and all of the impactful stuff that go along with race, or if you raise it up, not so close, but maybe it's even a product that you've spent your life's work on, that you have become the professional at, and somebody says, I love you, you're a great human being, but that product doesn't exist anymore. We don't need it anymore. And if people can't connect that, we will say, you are not your job, but that is almost impossible, right? Your limbic system won't disconnect from your neocortical system, your thinking system. And so when you have gotten it down, the whole work on behavioral economics and how people are incredibly tied to what and who they are and how it makes them feel. If you come along, your director comes along and says, the director of your organization goes, we're out of that business. And you don't feel something. You don't know what that means, or your business is at risk and you don't feel something. You don't go, okay, well, then we'll just figure it out and I'll just move on. I'm not buying it. We can't do it. We're human beings.
Tyrome, I couldn't agree more. I once heard, I can't remember who to attribute the quote to, but it was something along the lines of a man will never admit a truth if the truth would jeopardize their livelihood. So there are things that we're going to hold steadfast, even in the face of like evidence that the contrary is true. And it's so important to face those things head on and getting teams to a place where they can dive into the work. And, it's like, what are those unspeakables that we need to embrace? And so it's been really fun chatting today. I love that we touched on so many things related to facilitation that facilitators can kind of chew on at an almost meta level. This notion of people being citizens and how can we elevate their status so that they feel like they're part of some of a whole, that they're potentially even creating this thing that's bigger than themselves, and how we can be aligned to purpose. Really amazing stuff. I love the work that you're doing. I'm sure listeners are going to want to know how to reach out to you, how to connect. Tell us how they can find you.
It's super simple. I've been so busy over the last 5 years that even with GoIN, which stands for Government Transformation Through Innovation, GoIN, right? Government Innovation. That's my presence, but it's very simple. It's GOVT Innovation, all one word, GOVT Innovation, all one word, at gmail.com. It's very simple. Let's talk.
Excellent. Yeah. Shoot them an email, reach out. And Tyrome, it's been great chatting with you. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Control the Room. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates when new episodes are released. And if you want more, head over to our blog where I post weekly articles and resources about working better together. voltagecontrol.com.